let's talk about photographic deconstruction. First of all, let's define what photographic deconstruction is. In the art community, deconstruction applies to either photographs, drawings, paintings, sculptures, but it takes a piece of art and it breaks it down to study the 2D dimension aspects, or in the case of sculpture, 3D dimension aspects. It talks about where the light is coming from, how many things are, what's going on, and what you need to be looking at, be looking for, specific types of colors that might be used, the overall tone, the alternative versions of it, and so forth. So for this presentation, I've taken the piece with Winston Churchill called The Roaring Lion, and this was shot by Yousef Karsh in, I believe, 1941. And let's talk about it a little bit. This photograph is of Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. He was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. At that time, he was considered to be one of the 5 most powerful men on earth. The photographer's name is Yousef Karsh. He was a Canadian. He actually started in Canada as a child, was apprenticed and moved to Boston to apprentice under John Garrow. He then went out and did photography in the Boston area and later moved back to Ottawa, Canada. And towards the end of his life, he moved back to Boston. This photograph was taken at the Canadian House of Parliament in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. This was done during a diplomatic visit to Ottawa, Ontario. He posed for a set of black and white images by the Canadian portrait photographer. This is the better known of the 2 sister images taken mere seconds apart, and this image was used to define the defiant spirit of the British during World War II. The image on which this presentation is based is that of Sir Churchill scowling bitterly at the photographer, as the photographer had just yanked the cigar out of the lips by Mr. Karsh. The memoirs of both Karsh and Churchill reflect that he had just left a meeting in Parliament and was not expecting to pose for photographs, let alone for a formal portraiture session. Mr. Churchill, Sir Churchill, regarded it at the time as a bit of an ambush, and Mr. Karsh completed the entire portrait session of 2 frames of film in under 2 minutes. And I mentioned that there were 2, it was 1 film holder, 2 pieces of film. Karsh reset the camera shutter, put the slide in the film carrier, pulled the magazine, flipped it, put it back in, pulled it out, and shot the second photograph. Shooting the second photograph, having yanked the cigar out of Mr. Churchill's lips, which was pretty cool. So let's look at the image in terms of a 2-dimensional object. Initially, the eye settles on the image, and it is quickly drawn to starting on the face, is quickly drawn to the 2 hands, typically going down and to the left, and then up to the right to the second hand, and then back to the face. That's the normal eye patterns as it goes around this. Then on the second exploration of this photograph by the eye, it starts at the handkerchief and then goes down to the table and then back to the gold chain, the gold watch chain on the buttons of his waistcoat. One of the signature styles of Karsh was to light the hands of his individuals with what were called snooted lights, which is a type of funnel, and to light 1 or 2 props or clothing accessories with individual snooted lights as well. The main light, which we'll explore shortly, was to light up his rear shoulder. So there was a single source backlight. Then he had one snoot on the hand on the hip, one snoot on the chair, the hand on the chair. Then he used the main light, which was above and to the right, which was a 1200 watt tungsten hard box with a diffuser, to light the side of the face and then wrap around slightly and to capture the textures of the clothing and light the back, but not much. But you see the shadow on the left side of the subject's face. This also would have been 3200K tungsten with a diffused light, and it's obvious that the box is to the photographer's right, upper right. There's also a second light. This should actually be secondary light source, which was 750 watts, tungsten, 3500K, hard box diffuser. I have photographs of these light boxes later. And once these were made within just a few seconds of each other, there is an alternative exposure. So this is the same negative, but he did a very powerfully emotional, evocative one on the right, which everybody knows him for. But the one on the right, on the left, is the alternative printing. So the alternative printing is on the left. On the right is the final image that hangs in museums and in other places. The wood paneling was described as being 8 to 12 feet behind Mr. Churchill. In the image on which his paper is based, he's scowling, which is the scowl is more powerful by photographic manipulation in the printing process to drop out the background and make it darker, dodging and burning, and then pull his face up, pull his handkerchief and his shirt and his shadows, manipulate the shadows. So this is the alternative printing of -1, one being slightly lighter, one being the master work. And then this is the second image. This was taken several seconds after the first, and we can see that on the left side. So you can compare the image 1 versus image 2. You can see that it's much lighter. It's not as emotionally evocative. And time is held frozen in the moment of that defiant scowl, a scowl so defiant that the British, that it helped to encourage and rally England when its value in war propaganda and to define the spirit of the British a short time later in their conflict with Germany. So the image is in black and white, much like the majority of other classic images made by the same photographer, and considering that tungsten light alone was used to eliminate this image, the spectral responses of skin and fabric in his wool suit, cotton shirt, gold chain, and silk tie richly defined and well-defined textures in the actual viewed print, and less so on online versions. I've actually studied this myself within mere inches of the 30 by 40 inch print. The use of the frame is active and defines the vignette of the image. The vignette directs the eye to the face. While it does not contain the image, it also directs the eye. There is a decisive moment having occurred mere second or less before this image was recorded, and indeed the moment is likely caught on the face of the shutter. The form of the face, as well defined defined by the main and fill lighting, and the line of the head and shoulders well defined by the black or backlighting on the wood panel. It would also appear that a short telephoto lens was used for this image, given a background compression, but I was unable to find a definitive description of the lens used, although Mr. Karsh was always very fond of using a 455mm lens. Also, in the descriptive space is fairly shallow, and there's compression of that space, endorsing for a 450mm lens. I was not able to determine the paper or the film used on this image merely by looking at it, but on prior experience in my dealings with Mr. Karsh, he tended to use Kodak 400 8x10 film, and that his printer used a range of papers, but his printing tended to use a range of papers, but tended to use Kodak. Information on some of this was related to me in the 1980s by the staff of Kodak when I was there on a government training course, and they had a number of portraits done by Karsh on display right there in the factory. This is Yousef Karsh. This is one of his numerous Calumet 8x10 view cameras. I own one of his cameras. It was given as a gift to me by him, as well as several of the lenses which he used, because he always traveled with multiple cameras, multiple lenses. As he got older, he traveled with one camera and a couple of lenses, and he pre-positioned cameras and lenses all over the world, all exactly the same, so that he wouldn't have to travel with camera gear and lights and so forth. And so I have one of his kits, which he gifted to me. One of the most important tools for this is actually not the camera, but is the single release shutter bulb, which is a little air bulb that you squeeze to release the shutter. Because of the timing involved in getting the exact timing of the sitter, the time taking the photograph, or the exact moment when the photograph was taken, was the greatest magic for the capturing of this piece. This is the lens which he used to take. This is the equivalent of a 135mm lens. It was a Kodak 14-inch lens with a f-stop range of f6.3 to f45. He purchased it in 1940, so it was a relatively new lens when he bought it. The metric equivalent would be a 355mm, but he was also known to use a 455mm as well. So this is some of the various tools that he used. This was a beautiful purple cloth. All of his cloths were the same. Beautiful velvet cloth that he had fashioned into a dark hood or dark cloth. A good, solid tripod was, he felt, extraordinarily important to the photograph. And notice how he positions himself to the camera. Once the shutter's cocked and the film magazine has been replaced and set up, he would stand by his camera lens with the bulb in his hands and talk to the person who was sitting for him. And at the exact moment that he saw the expression or the scowl that he needed, he pushed the bulb and took the shot, flipped the magazine, and set it for a second shot. It was very rare for him to shoot more than 10 sheets of film for any sitting, and for quite a few he would do only 4, because he was extraordinarily good at what he did. This in here we see a 8x10 negative. You'll notice the carrier that he has it in. That is the carrier it's placed for development. He he had a staff that he developed all his own film and his own work himself in the early years. But as his fame became more and more wide known, he hired darkroom staff to develop his film. But even though they developed the film, he would be present, supervising the making of the final print and the intermediary print. These are some of the other items. We see a different Calumet 8x10. We see a different dark hood. You can see the lens has been dismounted from the lens board. You see the shutter release that looks like just a bulb. And then we see the flare hoods. And these are his favorite both studio and non-studio cameras. This is how he would typically set up his lighting. You see the background lighting, like what we see on a Churchill image. We have the main light, then we have the fill light, and then the snoots. And we'll look at these in a little more detail shortly. This is how he configured his main light. Nowadays, we would use soft boxes, but back in those days, this with the 5 tungsten bulbs, 5 250 watt bulbs, the barn doors would help to protect the glass, and there would normally be a glass diffuser used that was inserted in front of the glass. Sometimes they would take the diffuser out and change it with one that was not pearl colored, and they would put a slight red in, or slight green, or slight blue based on the person's complexion, age, and so forth. But the diffuser has been removed, and then of course the light stand. This is the fill light, which is 750 watt bulbs. It's 3 250 watt bulbs. It has the same barn doors. It's interior white. It's stainless steel, or it's painted steel. It has a diffuser that's been removed, and it's on a light stand. Now, he also used for his background lights, it was the same as his fill lights, but he would only put one 250 watt bulb in it. Same thing. It could be a dish, but the background of this would be curved and not flat like we've seen with some of the others. This would usually have a silver interior and not a white, and then he would use the same film stands as everything else. But this light would typically be down and throw light up on the background, and not much light is actually needed for that. These are the snoots he used. These were typically 250 watts or less. Then there would be a snoot tube put on the front of this light so that he was very precise and surgical with exactly what light was falling on what. So, for example, in this image, we can see that he's using multiple lights, on the hands, on the handkerchief, and so forth. Now, I should point out that I've been fascinated with this photographer for many decades. I consider this to be one of his most powerful, and the only one that I would regard as more powerful was his portrait of Albert Schweitzer and his portrait of Billy Graham, actually. Additionally, in a biography about Karsh entitled Faces of Our Time, the photographer recounts the Churchill portraits, which we've just seen. And I quote, "He was in no mood for portraiture, and 2 minutes were all he would allow me as he passed from the House of Commons chamber to the anteroom. 2 niggardly minutes in which I must try to put on film a man who has already written or inspired a library of books, baffled by all of his biographers, filled the world with his fame, and me on this occasion with dread. Churchill's cigar was ever present. I held out an ashtray, but he would not dispose of it. I went back to my camera and made sure that everything was all right, technically. I waited. He continued to chomp vigorously at his cigar. I waited. Then I stepped forward him, and without premeditation and ever so respectfully, I said, "Forgive me, sir," and plugged the cigar out of his mouth. By that time, I got back to my camera. He looked so belligerent that he would have devoured me. It was at that exact instant I took the photograph. Within every man and woman, a secret is hidden. And as a photographer, it is my task to reveal it if I can. The revelation, if it comes at all, will come at a brief fraction of a second, when an unconscious gesture, a gleam of the eye, a brief lifting of the mask that under all humans wear to conceal their innermost selves from the world, in that fleeting interval of opportunity, the photographer must act or lose his prize. There is a brief moment when all there is in a man's mind and soul and spirit is reflected through his eyes, his hands, and his attitude. This is the moment to record. Thank you for your time.